He wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to lead someone. The dog moved through the forest like a shadow that refused to fade, each step uneven but certain, as if pain had no say in the direction he chose. His coat, once thick and proud, was dulled by dust and time, and one ear dipped slightly lower than the other, not from weakness, but from wear, the kind earned over miles no one had witnessed. And yet his eyes, those steady amber eyes, never lost their focus, fixed on something ahead, something only he understood. The morning air carried the quiet chill of early fall in the northern woods, somewhere beyond the reach of highways and noise, where pine needles carpeted the earth and the scent of sap and damp bark clung to every breath. And the silence wasn't empty. It was watchful, like the forest itself was waiting. Miles away, Claire Donovan stood on the wooden steps of her cabin, a chipped mug warming her hands, steam rising slow into the pale light, her posture straight out of habit. Even now, even years after she'd traded uniform for solitude, because some disciplines don't fade, they settle into the bones. The way her eyes scanned the treeline without thinking, always checking, always measuring distance and movement, even when there was nothing there, or at least, nothing she wanted to see. She had chosen this place because it didn't ask questions, because the nights were quiet enough to outrun memory, and because no one here knew the name she used to answer to, the one etched into metal tags she no longer wore but never threw away. The wind shifted, just slightly, and something in it changed, not stronger, not louder, just different, enough to make her pause mid-sip, her gaze narrowing toward the edge of the clearing where the trees grew thicker and the light thinned out. And that's when she saw him, not all at once, not in full, just a movement between shadows, a shape that didn't belong to the rhythm of branches and leaves. And then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, as if crossing an invisible line. And the moment his paws touched the open ground, the silence deepened. Claire didn't move, not yet, her instincts pulling tight like a wire, because the dog wasn't acting like any stray she'd seen before. He didn't circle, didn't hesitate, didn't lower his head in fear or lift it in challenge. He simply stood there, looking at her, not pleading, not threatening, just waiting, and there was something in that stillness that unsettled her more than any sound could. "You're a long way from anywhere, aren't you?" she murmured under her breath, the words barely leaving her lips, more reflex than invitation. But the dog didn't respond the way she expected, didn't inch closer or retreat. Instead, he turned his head slightly, glancing back, toward the trees, then back at her again. A small motion, almost nothing, but intentional, precise, like a signal given in silence. Claire exhaled slowly, setting the mug down on the railing, her fingers lingering on the chipped ceramic as if grounding herself to something familiar. Because there was a feeling creeping in now, one she hadn't allowed in a long time. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes before memory catches up, the kind that says this moment matters, even if you don't yet know why. The dog took a step back, just one, then another, not turning away completely, just enough to shift the distance between them. And again he looked at her, steady, patient, as if time meant nothing to him, as if he could stand there all day until she understood. Claire's jaw tightened slightly, a habit from years of holding decisions under pressure, and for a second, she almost turned away, almost stepped back into the cabin, closed the door, and let the forest keep its secrets the way it always had. But her feet didn't move, and her eyes stayed locked on his, because something about that gaze felt familiar, not in detail, but in weight, like it carried something unfinished. The wind moved again, brushing through the trees with a low whisper, and the dog shifted once more, this time taking a few steps toward the treeline before stopping, glancing back over his shoulder, not checking if she was still there, but if she was ready. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Claire Donovan realized something she couldn't explain, something she didn't want to admit, that this wasn't a chance encounter, and whatever waited beyond those trees had already found her. Claire did not remember deciding to move, only that her boots were already on the ground, the wood of the porch creaking softly behind her as she stepped forward, drawn not by trust but by something quieter, something that felt like obligation without a voice. And the dog watched her with that same steady patience, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. The distance between them closed slowly, each step measured, the crunch of gravel under her boots sounding louder than it should in the stillness. And when she stopped a few feet away, she finally saw him clearly. The subtle tremor in his stance, the way his breathing came a little too shallow, the faint line along his side where fur had thinned and skin showed through in uneven patches, not fresh, not urgent, but not healed either, and yet none of it explained the way he held himself, upright, alert, as if whatever had worn him down had failed to break what mattered. "You should not be out here alone," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, her voice carrying the low, steady tone she once used to calm others, though she had not needed it in a long time. And for a moment, she reached out, her hand hovering just short of his head, testing the space between instinct and permission, but the dog did not lean in, did not flinch, did not even blink. He simply held her gaze, and then, with a small shift of weight, he turned again toward the trees. It was not a retreat, not avoidance. It was direction, clear and deliberate, and he took 3 steps forward before stopping, glancing back once more. That same look, that same silent question, and Claire felt it then, sharper now, the pull beneath her ribs, the echo of something she had buried under years of distance and routine, the part of her that recognized signals before words, that knew when movement meant more than motion. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders tightening as if bracing against something unseen, and she glanced back at the cabin behind her, the door still open, the mug still resting where she left it, a small, ordinary life waiting just a few yards away, safe, contained, untouched, and for a second, she almost chose it, almost turned back, but the dog had already taken another step, and this time he did not look over his shoulder. "Hey," she called softly, the word slipping out before she could stop it, and he paused. Just enough, just long enough for her to know he had heard, but not long enough to invite hesitation. Claire ran a hand through her hair, the motion restless, unplanned, and then she moved, following him into the tree line where the light shifted and the air cooled, the scent of pine growing stronger with every step, and the world behind her seemed to fade faster than it should. The open clearing swallowed by branches and shadow until it felt like it had never been there at all. The forest, closed in quietly, not threatening, but watchful, the kind of silence that carried weight instead of emptiness. And Claire found herself adjusting her pace to match his, noticing how he moved not in a straight line, but in a path that curved just slightly, avoiding fallen branches, stepping over roots without looking down, as if he had walked this way before, more than once. She glanced at the ground, searching for tracks, for anything that might tell her where he had come from. But the forest floor was soft with old needles and scattered leaves, holding no clear marks, and that unsettled her more than anything, because there should have been something, some sign, some trace of how a dog like this had made it all the way to her cabin without being seen. "What are you trying to show me?" she murmured, her voice low, steady, but edged now with something she could not quite name, and the dog slowed slightly, his ears shifting at the sound, not back, not forward, just enough to acknowledge her presence. And then he continued, deeper into the trees where the light thinned further and the air grew stiller, as if even the wind had chosen not to follow. Claire felt it then, a subtle change, not in the forest, but in herself, the way her senses sharpened, the way her steps became quieter, more deliberate, the way her mind began to map the space around her without effort, measuring distance, noting direction. The old instincts rising not as memory, but as something still, alive beneath the surface, waiting for a reason to return, and she realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that she was no longer just following a wounded dog. She was moving towards something that had already been set in motion long before she stepped off that porch, and somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of sight, the dog was leading her not away from her life, but straight into the part of it she had tried hardest to leave behind. The deeper they moved, the quieter the forest became, until even the sound of her own breathing felt out of place, and Claire slowed instinctively, her boots finding softer ground, her steps adjusting without conscious thought, as if the years had never passed, as if she had never left that other life behind. The dog continued ahead, steady, unhurried, never once looking lost, and that was what unsettled her most. not the silence, not the isolation, but the certainty in his movement, because animals wandered, they searched, they reacted. But this one, he navigated, like he was following a map only he could see. Claire glanced at the sky through the thin gaps between branches, trying to gauge direction, but the light was diffused now, muted into a pale gray that offered no clear sense of time or orientation, and she realized with a quiet tension tightening in her chest that she had stopped marking her path several minutes ago, something she never used to allow, not even on the safest terrain. Yet here she was, deeper than she intended, guided by something she could not explain. The dog slowed again, just slightly, his ears shifting as if catching a sound she could not hear, and Claire froze in place, her posture straightening, her head tilting ever so slightly as she listened, the forest holding its breath around her. And for a moment there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves settling and the distant creak of wood somewhere unseen. But then it came, not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one, a pocket of stillness ahead that felt wrong, like the space itself was withholding something. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely more than air, and the dog did not answer, did not move. He simply stood there, fixed on a point beyond the next line of trees, and Claire felt that pull again, stronger now, not curiosity, not fear, but recognition, the kind that settles in before understanding catches up. She took a step forward, then another, her senses sharpening further, every detail becoming clearer, the texture of bark under her fingertips as she brushed past a trunk, the faint scent of old wood carried on the air, not fresh pine, but something aged, something that had been standing untouched for years. And that was when she saw it, not all at once, but in pieces, a straight edge where there should have been none, a darker line cutting through the pattern of trees, and then the shape formed, subtle at first, then undeniable, a structure set back just enough to remain hidden unless you knew where to look. Claire stopped, her breath catching not from exertion, but from the sudden shift in awareness, and the dog moved again, closing the final distance between them and the structure with quiet certainty, his pace unchanged, as if this had always been the destination. The cabin stood still and silent, its wood weathered to a dull gray, edges softened by time, the roof sagging slightly at one corner, and yet there was nothing abandoned about it, not truly, because the door was not fully closed, not open either, just resting against the frame as if someone had left in a hurry or expected to return. Claire's eyes scanned the perimeter automatically, noting the lack of tracks, the absence of tools, the way the ground around the cabin looked undisturbed, too undisturbed, like no one had walked there in a long time. And yet the air carried that same faint scent she noticed earlier, old wood, something lived in once, something that had not completely let go. "This place should not be here," she murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them, because she knew this forest, not every inch, but enough to recognize what did not belong. And this felt misplaced, like a memory inserted where it did not fit. The dog reached the steps and paused, not climbing, not entering, just standing at the base, his body angled slightly toward the door, his head lifting just enough to indicate what lay beyond. And for the first time since she had seen him, he did not look back at her. He did not check if she followed, as if that part no longer mattered, as if he had brought her exactly where she needed to be. Claire approached slowly, each step measured, her eyes fixed on the narrow gap of the door, the darkness beyond it holding its own kind of weight, not threatening, not welcoming, just present, waiting, and she felt it then, a shift inside her, deeper than instinct, deeper than memory, something old stirring, something she had buried under distance and silence. And as she reached the bottom step, her hand lifting toward the worn wood of the railing, she realized with a quiet, steady certainty that whatever waited inside that cabin was not just a secret. It was something connected to her, something that had been waiting far longer than she had been ready to face it. Claire did not rush the final steps, though every instinct inside her urged movement, urged action, because the space around the cabin felt suspended in a way she had not felt in years, like time itself had slowed to watch what she would do next. Her fingers brushed the rough railing as she climbed the short set of steps, the wood dry and splintered beneath her touch, and she noted automatically that there was no recent wear, no sign of footsteps, No disturbance in the dust gathered along the edges, yet the door remained slightly open, just enough to suggest intention, not decay, and that contradiction tightened something in her chest. Behind her, the dog remained still at the base, his presence steady, no longer guiding, no longer signaling, as if his role had shifted from leader to witness, and Claire felt that shift without needing to turn around. She reached the door and paused, her hand hovering just inches from the surface, the faint scent of aged wood and something else. Drifting through the narrow gap, something familiar but distant, like a memory she could almost grasp but not yet name. "You brought me here," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer now, not directed at the dog, not directed at anyone in particular, just spoken into the space between past and present, and for a moment she stood there, listening, not for a sound, but for a feeling, for anything that might tell her whether to step forward or walk away. Nothing answered, and that in itself felt like an answer. She pushed the door gently, the hinges responding with a low, drawn-out creak that seemed louder than it should in the stillness, and the interior revealed itself slowly, not all at once, but in layers, shapes emerging from shadow as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through narrow windows along the far wall. The air inside was cool and unmoving, carrying the scent of dust, old timber, and something faintly metallic that lingered at the edge of perception without fully forming. And Claire stepped across the threshold, her boots meeting the worn wooden floor with a muted sound that echoed just enough to remind her how empty the space should have been. The room was simple, almost bare, a small table near the center, two chairs, one slightly angled as if it had been pushed back in haste or left mid-motion. And along the wall, a narrow shelf holding objects that had not been touched in a long time, their surfaces dulled by a thin layer of dust that caught the light in quiet patterns. Claire moved slowly, her gaze sweeping from one detail to the next, her mind cataloging without effort, noting the placement of each item, the absence of others, the way the space felt preserved rather than abandoned, like it had been left exactly as it was for a reason. Her eyes settled on the table, and she stepped closer, drawn by something she could not yet see clearly, her breath steady, controlled, though her chest felt tighter with every step. And as she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly across the surface, the dust shifted beneath her touch, revealing a faint outline where something had once rested, something recently moved, not long ago, not by time alone. She froze, her hand still against the wood, and that was when she felt it, not a sound, not a movement, but a presence in the room that had not been there a moment before, or perhaps had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. Claire straightened slowly, her senses sharpening, every detail snapping into focus, the angle of the light, the stillness of the air, the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides, and she turned her head just slightly, enough to shift her perspective without fully breaking her stance, her eyes moving toward the far corner of the room where the shadows gathered more thickly. For a moment, she saw nothing, just the outline of stacked wood and the faint suggestion of something against the wall, but then the shape resolved, not suddenly, but gradually, as if her mind needed time to accept what it was seeing, and her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. The kind that settles deep before it reaches the surface. No. The word escaped her, barely more than a whisper, and she took a step forward without thinking, her focus narrowing, the rest of the room fading away as the past she had tried to leave behind began to rise, piece by piece, from the quiet stillness of that forgotten place. Claire moved closer with slow, measured steps, as if any sudden motion might break whatever fragile thread held this moment together. Her eyes locked on the shape in the corner, the edges of it sharpening with each breath she took, and as the dim light settled across it, the details came into focus, not all at once, but piece by piece, until there was no denying what stood before her. It was a chair, simple, wooden, worn by time, positioned at an angle that suggested it had once faced the center of the room, and draped over its back was a jacket, faded, dusted with age, but unmistakable in its form, the cut of it, the weight of it, the kind issued, not bought, and Claire's chest tightened as recognition struck deeper than she expected. She stepped closer, her hand lifting almost without permission, fingers brushing against the fabric, and the dust shifted softly beneath her touch, revealing a patch on the sleeve. Worn but still visible, a name stitched in dark thread that time. Had not fully erased. She leaned in slightly, her breath catching as the letters came into view. And for a moment, the forest outside, the dog, the cabin, all of it fell away, leaving only that name, suspended between memory and reality. Miller, she whispered, the word barely audible, yet heavy enough to fill the room. And the moment it left her lips, something inside her shifted, not sudden, not sharp, but deep. Like a door she had sealed long ago had quietly opened again. She straightened. Slowly, her eyes scanning the rest of the space with new awareness, seeing details she had missed before. A metal canteen resting near the base of the wall, its surface dulled but intact. A pair of worn boots placed side by side beneath the table, not discarded, not abandoned, but left with care, as if their owner had expected to return at any moment. Claire's mind moved faster now, connecting fragments, pulling threads she had buried beneath. Years of silence, and the memory surfaced, not as a full picture, but in flashes, a mission deep in unfamiliar terrain, a team reduced by distance and confusion, a call that had not been answered, a name spoken into static with no reply. She turned slightly, her gaze falling to the floor where faint markings interrupted the thin layer of dust, subtle, nearly invisible. But there, lines where something had been moved, recently enough to disturb the stillness, but not enough to erase the past. And her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. You were here, she said under her breath, not asking, not doubting, just stating what had already become clear, and the room seemed to listen, holding her words in the quiet air. Behind her, the faint sound of movement broke through the silence, soft, deliberate, and Claire turned just enough to see the dog at the doorway now, no longer at the base of the steps, his presence filling the entrance without crossing fully. Inside, his eyes fixed on her, not urging, not guiding, just watching. She looked back at the chair, at the jacket, at the name that should not have been there, and the realization settled fully now, heavier than before, steadier, undeniable. This was not a coincidence, not a forgotten shelter in the woods, not a random discovery stumbled upon by chance. This was something that had been waiting, something that had remained untouched until now, until she stepped through that door. Claire exhaled slowly, her hand lowering from the fabric as she took a step back, her gaze shifting between the objects in the room and the dog in the doorway. And for the first time since she had followed him into the forest, she understood the weight of his silence, the reason he had not stayed, had not asked for help, had not sought comfort. He had not come to be saved. He had come to bring her here. Her eyes returned to the name once more, lingering there as the memory behind it sharpened, filling in the spaces she had tried to leave empty. And she felt it then, not just recognition, but responsibility, rising steady and unavoidable, because whatever had happened in this place, whatever had been left unfinished, it was not just his story waiting in this cabin. It was hers. Claire stood still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the name stitched into the worn fabric, her mind no longer resisting what it recognized, because resistance required doubt, and there was none left now, only the quiet, steady return of something she had tried for years to keep buried beneath distance and silence. She reached into her jacket slowly, her fingers brushing against the cool metal that rested against her chest, and she pulled it free, the chain sliding softly through her hand as two dog tags caught the dim light of the cabin, one her own, the other one she had never been able to let go of, not because she believed it still belonged to her, but because she had never known where else it should be. She held them in her palm for a second, the weight of them grounding her, and then she stepped toward the chair again, lifting the tags slightly as her eyes moved between the metal and the stitched name, confirming what her instincts had already accepted. "I thought you were gone," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a depth she had not allowed herself to feel in years, and the room seemed to absorb the words without echo, as if it had been waiting to hear them. The memories came more clearly now, no longer fragmented, no longer distant, but close, detailed, unavoidable, a mission that had gone off course, a call that had come too late, a decision made in a moment that had stretched into years of silence afterward, and one name that had never stopped following her. no matter how far she went or how quiet she kept her life. Miller. She exhaled slowly, lowering the tags as her gaze shifted across the room again, seeing it differently now, not as an abandoned space, but as a place that had been held in time, preserved by something more than circumstance, and her attention moved to the small table once more, to the faint outline she had uncovered earlier, and she stepped closer, brushing the dust aside with more purpose this time, revealing a rectangular shape, the edges clean, recent enough to stand out against the rest of the undisturbed surface. Her fingers traced the outline lightly, her mind already forming the possibility before she fully saw it, and she glanced toward the shelf along the wall, her instincts guiding her before her thoughts could catch up. And there, tucked behind a small metal container, she found it, a worn notebook, its cover faded but intact, placed deliberately out of immediate sight, but not hidden completely, as if it had been left for someone who knew where to look. Claire picked it up slowly, the weight of it surprising her slightly, not heavy, but enough to feel real, enough to confirm that this was not just a memory preserved in objects, but something that had been added to, something that had changed. She hesitated for a brief second, her thumb resting along the edge of the cover, and then she opened it. The pages inside were filled with handwriting, steady, deliberate, each line placed with care, not rushed, not scattered, but intentional, and Claire felt her breath slow as she scanned the first few lines, not reading every word yet, just enough to recognize the tone, the structure, the way the thoughts were laid out, and there was no doubt now. None at all. This was his. She closed her eyes briefly, not to shut it out, but to steady herself, to allow the moment to settle before moving forward, because whatever was written inside those pages was not just a record of time. It was a bridge between what had been left unfinished and what she had been brought here to face. Behind her, the dog shifted slightly at the doorway, the faint sound of his movement grounding her again, reminding her that she was not alone in this space, not in the way she had been for so long. And she turned her head just enough to see him there, his posture unchanged, his eyes still fixed on her, not expectant, not impatient, just present. She looked back at the notebook, her fingers tightening slightly around it, and she took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke again, not to the dog, not to the room, but to the man whose name had never truly left her. "You waited," she said, and the weight of that realization settled deeper than anything before it, because waiting meant intention, meant time had passed, and something had endured through it, something that had not been erased by distance or silence. Claire opened the notebook again, this time allowing her eyes to move fully across the page, and as the words began to take shape in her mind, she understood that whatever had happened here, whatever had been left behind, it had not been meant to stay hidden forever. It had been meant to be found, and somehow, against all odds, it had found its way back to her. Claire turned the first page slowly, the faint rasp of paper against paper sounding louder than it should in the stillness, and her eyes settled on the handwriting, steady and deliberate, the kind that came from someone who had learned to control every motion, every line, as if even ink on a page needed discipline. She read the first sentence in silence, her lips barely moving as the words formed, and something inside her tightened, not from shock, but from the quiet certainty that this was not a record of survival. It was something else entirely. "If anyone finds this, it means the dog made it," she whispered under her breath, the sentence landing heavier than its simplicity suggested, and she paused, her gaze lifting briefly from the page as her eyes moved toward the doorway where the dog still stood, unmoving, watching. She looked back down, her focus sharpening as she continued, each line unfolding not as a story, but as a series of moments, carefully placed, as if he had known exactly how much time he had, and had chosen every word with purpose. There were no complaints, no fear written between the lines, only clarity, observations of the forest, the cabin, the passage of days marked not by dates, but by changes in light, in weather, in the way the silence shifted around him. And Claire felt her breath slow as she read, her body instinctively mirroring the rhythm of the writing, steady, controlled, grounded. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the notebook when she reached a line that mentioned her, not by full name, but enough a reference to a decision made, a moment that had not gone the way it was meant to, and her chest rose and fell once, deeper than before, as she held there for a second, the past no longer abstract, no longer distant, but written plainly in ink she could not ignore. "You did what you had to," she read softly. The words both unexpected and impossible to accept, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in denial, but in the quiet struggle of hearing something she had never allowed herself to believe. The next lines shifted again, returning to observation, to the dog, to the way he had stayed, had watched, had refused to leave even when there was nothing left to guide him. And Claire glanced up once more, her eyes finding him at the doorway, his posture unchanged, his presence steady as it had been from the moment she first saw him. And for the first time, she understood the depth of what that meant. Not just loyalty, but purpose carried beyond time, beyond distance. She looked back at the page, turning it slowly, her breath steady but heavier now, and the handwriting remained consistent, unwavering, until it reached the final section, where the lines grew shorter, more spaced, not rushed, but measured differently, as if each word required more effort than the last. She read them carefully, her voice barely audible as the words formed. "If she ever finds this, tell her it was not her fault," and the sentence settled into the space around her, filling it in a way that no sound had before, and Claire felt something inside her shift, not breaking, not collapsing, but loosening, like a weight she had carried so long she no longer remembered how it felt to set it down. Her hand lowered slightly, the notebook resting against her palm as she stood there, the silence returning, but different now, no longer heavy, no longer pressing in from all sides, but open, like the room itself had exhaled. She turned her head slowly toward the doorway again, her eyes meeting the dog's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The connection between them no longer unspoken, no longer uncertain, but clear, understood without explanation. "You knew," she said quietly, the words simple, but carrying everything she had just read, everything she had just realized. And the dog did not respond with movement or sound. He simply held her gaze, steady, calm, as if this had always been the end of the path he had walked. Claire looked back down at the notebook one last time, her fingers brushing lightly over the final page, and then she closed it gently, the cover settling into place with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something that had been waiting far too long, and the beginning of something she had not known she needed until this moment found her. Claire did not move right away after closing the notebook, her hand still resting on its worn cover, as if letting go too quickly might undo what had just settled inside her. And the silence around her no longer pressed against her chest the way it had before. Instead, it held something softer now, something that felt almost like permission. She drew in a slow breath, deeper than any she had taken since stepping into the forest. And for the first time in years, it did not catch halfway, did not tighten against memory. It moved freely, steady, real. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the cabin one more time, not searching now, not analyzing, just seeing. The chair with the jacket no longer a question, the table no longer a mystery, the space no longer suspended between past and present, but complete, as if something unfinished had finally reached its end. Behind her, the dog shifted again, and this time the sound was different, not a pause, not a signal, but a quiet release of tension, and Claire turned toward him fully, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without uncertainty. For a moment, they simply stood there, the distance between them unchanged, but the meaning of it entirely different, no longer a gap to be crossed, but a space shared, understood. She stepped toward the doorway slowly, the notebook still in her hand, her movements calm, deliberate, and when she reached the threshold, she stopped just long enough to glance back inside, her eyes resting briefly on the jacket, on the place where the past had waited for her. And then she stepped out into the forest air. The light outside felt different now, warmer, though the sky had not changed, the same pale gray stretching above the trees. And yet everything seemed clearer, the edges of the world sharper, the sounds of the forest returning in quiet layers, distant leaves shifting, a branch settling somewhere unseen, the wind moving gently through the canopy as if it had been waiting to breathe again. The dog moved then, not ahead of her, not leading, but stepping down from the doorway and coming to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of his presence without him touching her, and she looked down at him, really looked this time, seeing not just the wear in his coat or the steadiness in his stance, but the quiet resolve that had carried him all the way to her, that had brought her here without a single sound. She lowered herself slowly, one knee touching the ground, her movements careful, respectful, and she reached out again, her hand moving toward his head, not testing now, not hesitating, and this time, the dog leaned into her touch, just slightly, just enough to close the distance that had existed between them since the beginning. Claire let her hand rest there, her fingers brushing through his fur with a gentleness she had not allowed herself in a long time, and she exhaled softly, the breath carrying something with it, something she had been holding on to without realizing it. "It is done," she said quietly, the words simple, but grounded in a truth that no longer needed to be questioned. And the dog remained still beneath her hand, not reacting, not moving away, just present, as if that was all he had ever needed to be. Claire rose after a moment, her posture straight but lighter now, and she looked out into the forest, not as something to navigate, not as something to endure, but as something that could be walked through without carrying everything behind her. She glanced down at the notebook in her hand, then back at the cabin, and there was no hesitation this time. No pull to stay, no need to look again. Whatever had been waiting there had found her, and whatever she had been carrying had finally been answered. The dog stepped forward then, not to lead, but to move, and Claire followed, not because she was being guided, but because she chose to walk, and for the first time since she had stepped off that porch, the path ahead did not feel like something unknown. It felt like something she could finally face without looking back. The forest did not feel the same on the way back, though the trees had not moved and the path had not changed, and Claire noticed it with a quiet awareness that did not need explanation, because the difference was not in the world around her. It was in the weight she no longer carried as she walked. Her steps were steady, measured out of habit, but lighter now, no longer driven by avoidance or distance, and the air moved more freely through the trees, the faint sound of wind returning in soft layers, brushing through branches, stirring leaves in a rhythm that felt almost like a welcome rather than a warning. Beside her, the dog kept pace without effort, not ahead, not behind, simply there, his presence no longer a question to be solved, but a truth she had already accepted, and every now and then she glanced down at him, not to check, not to confirm, but because something in her needed to acknowledge what he had done, even if words could not fully hold it. They walked in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that no longer pressed in, but opened out, and when the tree line finally began to thin, when the faint outline of her cabin came into view through the branches, Claire slowed just slightly, not from hesitation, but from the quiet realization that she was returning not to the same place she had left, but to something that had changed because she had. The cabin stood where it always had, simple, still, the porch catching the soft gray light of the afternoon, and the mug she had left behind remained where she had set it, a small, ordinary detail that somehow felt more significant now, as if the life she had paused had been waiting patiently for her to step back into it. She approached the steps and stopped, her eyes lifting briefly to the door, then lowering again to the dog at her side, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet between them carrying a different kind of understanding, one that did not need to be spoken. "You do not have to lead anymore," she said softly, her voice calm, steady, not a command, not a release, just an acknowledgement of something that had already shifted, and the dog looked up at her, his amber eyes steady as they had been from the beginning, but softer now, as if the purpose that had carried him through the forest had finally settled into something at rest. Claire crouched slowly, her hand reaching out once more, resting gently against the side of his neck, her fingers brushing through his fur in a motion that was no longer tentative, no longer searching, but certain, and she held there for a moment, feeling the quiet warmth beneath her palm, the steady presence that had brought her back not just to this place, but to something deeper she had not known she needed. She stood again after a few seconds, her posture straight, but no longer rigid, and she turned toward the cabin, taking a single step up onto the porch before pausing, glancing back one last time. The dog had not moved, not yet. still standing at the edge of the clearing where the forest met the open space, his figure framed by the trees, still, composed, as if he belonged equally to both worlds. And Claire watched him for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need closure because it was already complete. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, crossing the distance without hesitation this time, climbing the steps and coming to stand beside her, not as a guide, not as something passing through, but as something that had chosen to stay. Claire opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood and quiet filling the space, and the dog followed, his presence settling into the room as naturally as if he had always been there. And she set the notebook down carefully on the table, her fingers lingering on its cover for just a second before letting go. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying no urgency, no signal, just the steady rhythm of something continuing as it always had. And inside, Claire stood, still for a moment, her eyes closing briefly, her breath slow and even, not escaping anything, not holding anything back, just existing in the quiet that remained. When she opened her eyes again, she did not look toward the forest, did not turn back toward the path she had taken. She simply moved forward, one step at a time, and the dog lay down near the door, his body settling into stillness. His watch no longer fixed on something distant, but resting in the present, and in that quiet, without announcement, without certainty, something small and steady took its place where something heavy had once been, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to be felt, like a promise that had finally been kept.